I think there are 5 reasons we should embrace the autumn like C.S. Lewis. He said many times autumn was his favourite season. For instance, in one letter he said, I'd prefer some real autumn weather. To me, crisp autumn days with leaves changing colour is the crown of the year. You'd almost say he was an autumn baby, born right at the end of November. And the first reason for embracing autumn like Lewis is that his idea of the perfect autumn day was as a bearer of joy. And that meant ultimately for Lewis that they were pointers to Christ. In his early childhood, Lewis was particularly struck by the Beatrix Potter book Squirrel Nutkin and the idea of autumn that it conjured up for him. He said, it sounds fantastic to say that one can be enamoured of a season, but that's something like what happened. He says that in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy. And the Beatrix Potter gave him one of his early glimpses of the particular kind of joy that called to him his whole life. It's a kind of burning desire that for a moment took him to another dimension, he said. And he'd often go back to Squirrel Nutkin to try and reawaken those moments of desire. So here's a bit for you. One autumn, when the nuts were ripe and the leaves on the hazel bushes were golden and green, Nutkin and Twinkleberry and all the other little squirrels came out of the wood and down to the edge of the lake. They made little rafts out of twigs and they paddled away over the water to Owl Island to gather nuts. Each squirrel had a little sack and a large oar and spread out his tail for a sail. It's a charming woodland story full of autumn's fruitfulness, nuts and crab apples and fir cones, and all in autumn colours. The squirrels searched for nuts all over the island and filled their little sacks, but Nutkin gathered oak apples, yellow and scarlet, and sat upon a beech stump playing marbles and watching the door of old Mr. Brown. I'm sure the lovely illustrations helped create that idea of autumn, which was such a channel of joy for him too. He often describes with delight the beauty of the season in his letters. Soon after he came to live in Surrey as a teenager with a private tutor, he said it was a veritable paradise of gold and copper. I've never seen anything like it. And after he'd been on a trip back to see his father in Belfast, he wrote to his friend there, Arthur Greaves, saying, "The country at home was beginning to look nice and autumny, with dead leaves in the lanes and a nice nutty smell. Here," that's back in Surrey, "is horrible bright summer, which I hate." He really didn't like summer. It was too hot, too bright. His tutor said it was the most unnatural state of mind. And much later, in October 1956, he described his idea of autumn at its very best: warm, coloured days, but cold nights and usually misty mornings, every cobweb on the hedge turned into a necklace by the heavy dew. So autumn days are a medium of the joy, and the joy, he says, by the end of Surprised by Joy, is not an end in itself, but essentially a pointer to Christ. So I'm trying to be alert to the joy of autumn this year. Another reason to embrace the autumn like Lewis lies in its moments of stillness and rest. Early on in his time in Surrey, Lewis wrote to Arthur Greaves, his Belfast friend. He said, "The glorious pageant of the waning year, lavishing her autumn glories on a lovely countryside, fills me whenever I take a solitary walk among the neighbouring hills with a great sense of comfort and peace." You see? His summer afternoon walks were okay, but he enjoyed more dearly, he says, autumn afternoons in bottoms that lay intensely silent under old and great trees. And when he describes summer turning deliciously into still, misty, voluptuous autumn, it makes me think of Keats and his season of mists and mellow fruitfulness. But also, with Lewis, a certain stillness after the intensity of summer. And you see this aspect of autumn in his novel, Till We Have Faces. And in Till We Have Faces, there comes a time when the Queen of Glome, Orual, fed up with the same old of ruling Glome year on year and always keeping herself busy. She tries to forget that the gods are set to punish her one day for this misguided thing she did earlier on in her life. And she decides to go travelling, as you do. And she goes to the kingdom of Esser, And the narrative makes this beautiful connection between the autumn weather and the availability of rest, which seems to present itself to her. It was the calmest day, pure autumn, very hot, yet the sunlight on the stubble looked aged and gentle, not fierce like the summer heats. You'd think the year was resting, its work done, and I whispered to myself that I too would begin to rest. I love this idea of the earth resting after all the rigours of summer. When I was back at Gloam, I'd no longer pile task on task. I'd let Bardia rest too. I often thought he began to look tired, and we'd let younger heads be busy, while we sat in the sun and talked of our old battles. What more was there for me to do? Why should I not be at peace? Why should I not be at peace, she says. I thought this was the wisdom of old age beginning. It's an invitation to Sabbath, you see, that day of holiness and rest. Why should I not be at peace? Aurore asks. But of course that vision of peace doesn't last out the day for Aurore. She has the chance in a wayside temple to face her own shortcomings, but she won't. And she puts all the blame on the gods. And immediately she knows that all the peace of that autumnal journey was shattered. I could never be at peace again till I'd written my charge against the gods. It burned from within. It's a question to ask, isn't it? And see where it takes us. Why should I not be at peace? How can I let this invitation to Sabbath draw me in? The third reason to embrace the autumn is the sense of awakening it brings. It's a time of stirring and awakening for Lewis. When he was 30, in a letter to his friend Arthur, he waxes lyrical on the delights of an early October in Oxford. He says, I walked into town by Cuckoo Lane and Mesopotamia after tea. The real autumn tang in the air has begun. And there was one of those almost white skies with a touch of frosty red over the town and the beginnings of lovely colouring in the college garden. And he goes on to say that he feels more and more that as nature outwardly is dying in the autumn, he has the sense of something else coming awake. And he wonders, does one thing never sleep except to let something else wake? He remembers that the poet Milton felt most inspired in the autumn. And then there's a charming thank you letter to an American woman who had sent him a parcel of foodstuffs while rationing was still a thing after World War II. And he says to her, parcel insured number 4662 and containing all manner of delights has just arrived. That with an exquisite autumn morning, much the best season of the year for me. Anyone else may have all my summers if they'll give me their autumns, or falls, as you say, instead. And a good idea for a children's story, which also arrived this morning, I suppose from the subconscious, that bode well for a good day. He was probably talking there about Prince Caspian, which begins with the children on a railway station in September on their way back to boarding school after the long summer holiday. Though it seems to be summertime in Narnia when they get there. Anyway, after some further pleasantries comparing the woman to various goddesses of plenty, the letter ends, with all this talk, the autumn feeling, the stirring and waking, must have got into my head. I see I haven't even said thank you yet, but I've been meaning to say nothing else. Blessings on you. The autumn feeling, the stirring and waking, must have got into my head, he said. Time of stirring and waking. Fourthly, there's the call to adventure which comes with autumn. The beginning of autumn always gave Lewis a sense of excited anticipation. In a letter on the 1st of September in 1933, he described the coolness and thick mist and spangled cobwebs. I thought it was the first day of autumn and felt the old excitement. But later on the same day, he felt completely cheated because it turned into another blazing hot day. Pitiless blue sky, sun hammering bleached white grass, wasps buzzing, dragonflies darting, and Mr. Papworth panting in the shade with his tongue out. Mr. Papworth is the dog. And in October 1949, he says, Up till now, it's been paradisal, the sort of weather which for some reason excites me much more than spring. Cool, cobwebby mornings developing into the mildest sunlight and exquisite colours in the woods. It always gives me wanderlust and divine discontent and all that. In October 1955, we had our first frost last night. This morning the lawns are all grey with a pale, bright sunshine on them, wonderfully beautiful. And somehow exciting. The first beginning of winter always excites me. It makes me want adventures. Surprising, really, for all this, that the only time we get any autumn in Narnia is in the Silver Chair, when Jill and Eustace and Puddleglum the Marsh Wiggle set off on their adventure to find Prince Rilian, who's been captured by an evil witch. And Jill asks Puddleglum, she says, "Can you help us find Prince Rilian?" And the Marsh Wiggle sucked in his cheeks till they were hollower than you would have thought possible. "Well, I don't know that you'd call it help," he said. "I don't know that anyone can exactly help. It stands to reason we're not likely to get very far on a journey to the north, not at this time of year, with the winter coming on soon and all. And an early winter too, by the look of things. But you mustn't let that make you downhearted. Very likely, what with enemies and mountains and rivers to cross and losing our way and next to nothing to eat and sore feet, we'll hardly notice the weather." So that's the fourth reason to embrace autumn. It makes us want adventure. We're coming soon to the fifth reason, and we'll come to it through that Hideous Strength, the third in the cosmic trilogy. And this novel's full of weather. It's set during the late autumn, with classic descriptions of autumn days, just as Lewis liked them, bright sunny mornings with hazy blue skies and often a touch of frost. And the first thing we're told in the book about the character Mark, as we're introduced to him walking on his way to college, is that he fails to see the beauty of the October morning. There's a black mark against him right from the beginning. And then later, by contrast, his wife Jane, in a state of heightened joy, it says she saw from the windows of the train the outlined beams of sunlight pouring over stubble or burnished woods, and felt that they were like the notes of a trumpet. There's joy for you. But the fifth reason to embrace autumn with Lewis is not those perfect October mornings, but its wild side, the wild side of autumn. And the weather shifts later in that Hideous Strength to the less delightful side of autumn going on winter, with an almighty fog first, and then later fierce winds, such that it says the wildness crept into Jane's blood. And there's heavy rain and dark soaking fields and hedges when they go by night to search for Merlin, woken from the Dark Ages. Lewis actually called chapter 12 Wet and Windy Night. Terrific wind in particular accompanies Merlin's arrival in the manor house, which really suits the wildness of the man. Lewis's friend at Oxford, Jenkin, taught him to enjoy all weathers. He says in Surprised by Joy, "I learnt from him that we should attempt a total surrender to whatever atmosphere was offering itself at the moment. On a dismal day to find the most dismal and dripping wood, on a windy day to seek the windiest ridge. There was only a serious yet gleeful determination to rub one's nose in the very quiddity of each thing, to rejoice in its being so magnificently what it was." So, let's rub our noses in the wildness too when it comes. I'll be doing a video on the wild joy of C.S. Lewis before long. I'll put it in the description. That Hideous Strength ends amid the first snows of winter, and with a marvellous supernatural summer night in the middle of it all, brought on by Venus descending on the manor. But that's for another time too. In the meantime, let's embrace the beauty and the joy of autumn and the way it ultimately points us to Christ himself. Let's seek out the stillness and the Sabbath rest of those perfect autumn days and ask ourselves, why should I not be at peace? Let's listen for the stirring and the waking this autumn season and embrace the call to adventure and even rub our noses in the wildness of it. I'm going to.